vamos a tener charlas hoy en español, pero también en inglés. Entonces, si alguien quiere una diapositiva de traducción simultánea, pero que ahora ustedes vayan afuera para buscar este diapositivo. Y es muy recomendable tenerlo porque como yo he estado escuchando algunos charlas en español, hablo español, pero a veces me pierdo y como si tienes este diapositivo en mano, pues como ponerlo acá y retomar el hilo. Entonces, eso es el momento. Si quieres un diapositivo, búscalo. Yeah, I'll say the same thing in English really quickly. If you want a simultaneous translation device, they're right outside the front door. So now is a good time to go grab one. We're going to be having talks in Spanish and English today. So I'm going to start in English, and I want to start today by thanking everyone for making this event possible, for the people who are speaking, the people who traveled, the assistants who are just coming to watch and participate in these conversations that are super important. And also everyone who's been tuning in on streaming. It was really important for us to have streaming because not everyone, could travel from the Chilean regions to be here today, but we wanted to make these talks available not just in Santiago, but all over Chile and also all over the world because that's how the internet works. And I want to take a moment to thank our partners and sponsors, starting with the Spark Grant Initiative. As we've mentioned throughout this event, Sapecct exists thanks to funds from the Spark Grant Initiative competition, which is financially supported by the Science Journalists and Writers Associations from the United States, France, Italy, and Switzerland, who organized the World Conference of Science Journalism in 2017 in San Francisco. Those were the US organizations. And in 2019 in Lausanne in Europe. So in the case of the US, that's two organizations, the National Association of Science Writers and the Council for the Advancement of Science Writing. Sapecct is the third project that the Spark Grant Initiative has supported in its first round competition. The other two were the Himalayan Climate Bootcamp and the first French-speaking science journalism conference in Africa, which took place in Senegal. And we've been so lucky to have other sponsors as well, listed on the screen here, EurekAler, Abril Welcome Fund, Pfizer. We're having this event in the University of Andrés Bello. We also had a lot of support from Sapecct, the local science writers organization here in Chile. And many more, as you can see, listed below. So with the help of all these partners, we've been able to share so many amazing moments over the last 3 days. I've been so appreciative, and we've been able to bring speakers here from all over the world. We have 12 speakers from abroad today, from the Netherlands, Colombia, Argentina, traveling from Peru, the United States, Spain, Brazil, Mexico. And also we have brought some speakers from Chilean regions, which is very important, from Punta Arenas, Valdivia, Antofagasta, and more. So again, I want to just say remind all of our speakers, and I'm going to remind myself as well, because sometimes, when you're up here, you forget, but we are talking in 2 languages today. A lot of our participants are bilingual, but it's always helpful when we can speak a little more slowly. It's helpful for our simultaneous translators as well. So, remember to take that pause, slow down a little bit, just a little bit slower than you normally would talk if you can manage it. Voy a repetir esto también en español, que hoy estamos hablando en 2 idiomas. Tenemos traducción simultánea, pero muy útil, ayuda mucho si podemos intentar hablar un poco más lento que normal. So I now have the pleasure of introducing a representative of one of our sponsors who's been instrumental in making this project happen. So Brian Lin oversees EurekAler, a nonprofit news release distribution platform operated by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Brian has more than 2 decades of experience as a science communicator, having interned at a national daily technology TV show in Canada before serving as a press officer at the University of British Columbia. Since joining AAAS, that's the American Association for the Advancement of Science, in 2014, he has more than doubled traffic at EurekAler and led the development of a new platform that launched in 2021. His current focus is in expanding access to EurekAler in the Global South and fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion in and throughout science communication. Un fuerte aplauso para Brian Lin.
Gracias. Okay. Good morning. Buenos dias. It's a privilege to be here in Santiago with you. EurekAler is a news release distribution platform operated by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, also known as AAAS. We currently have about 11,000 journalist members from more than 90 countries and 10,000 public information officer members from 5,000 organizations worldwide. Roughly 80% of the world-ranked universities use EurekAler to disseminate their science-related news releases. To put it simply, universities, publishers, and funding agencies pay us a small fee to post their news releases on our website, and we make these news releases available for free to journalists and the public. Since our establishment in 1996, we have been a trusted source of science news for journalists and the public. There are things that we do really well. For example, we offer journalists an early look at the latest papers in journals like Science, PNAS, and Cell, so they have extra time to produce accurate and engaging stories. As a service of AAAS, a scientific society, EurekAler aims to facilitate equitable access to scientific information and broad communication of science. This is why we reinvest a portion of our revenue back into the science journalism and science communication communities by sponsoring events like this conference and last week's World Conference of Science Journalists in Medellin, Colombia. Next month, I will travel to Singapore to speak to a conference of early career scientists, and in June, we're sponsoring a training day for early career science journalists in the UK. When Lindsay and Paulina approached EurekAler as a sponsor for this event, we agreed enthusiastically because you have so much to teach us, from earthquake engineering to climate change, from winemaking to marine conservation to solving the mysteries of the universe. You have plenty to share with the world, and we are listening. When I lived in Vancouver, Canada, we learned about the Iquique earthquake in 2014 because Vancouver, like most of Chile, is on the ring of fire. But unlike Chile, Vancouver wasn't nearly as prepared for an 8.2 scale earthquake. So we learned from your expertise. On Sunday, I visited the Observatorio Manuel Foster in Cerro San Cristobal. The tour guide was a graduate student in astrophysics, and her love for science was so infectious that I was captivated even though I speak no Spanish. I have been so inspired by the passion, dedication, and ingenuity of science journalists and science communicators here and across Latin America. I hope that as you grow, you will show the world how diverse, equitable, and inclusive science and science communication can be. In fact, by offering simultaneous translation at this conference, you have made a wealth of knowledge from Chile available to me, an immigrant from Taiwan with no formal scientific training, but who loves to help scientists communicate their work. I hope that you will share your science with not just your city, your country, or the region, but the entire world. And when you are ready, EurekAler is ready to help. Thank you for trusting us as a partner of this conference, and thank you for all you do to advance science and serve society. Gracias.
Thanks so much, Brian. You're the model for slow and clear talking. That was amazing. Now I have the pleasure to introduce Martin Enserink, a deputy news editor at Science and based in Amsterdam. He was Science's international editor from 2018 through early this year, during which time he coordinated and edited news from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. He also edited a big portion of Science's COVID-19 coverage. Before becoming international editor, Martin also held roles at Science as a European correspondent based in Paris, and then as the magazine's European news editor. He has a master's degree in biology and has participated in various training programs for journalists, including SJ Coop, a program run by the World Federation of Science Journalists. And Martin has traveled really far to be with us here today, so let's give him a big round of applause. Un fuerte aplauso para Martin.
Thank you, Lindsay. Gracias. Oops. 1 second. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be at this meeting. It's a wonderful conference, and it's also my first time in Chile, and I really enjoy it here. I titled my talk, Science Journalism, the Best Job in the World, and I'll explain why I think that. And also, I want to talk to you about some questions and issues that I think science journalism should address. But first, I want to talk a little bit about me. I'm from the Netherlands, really, really tiny country in Europe. It has about the same number of people as Chile, but only 5% of the size. I am a biologist by training. I got a master's degree at the University of Groningen. But I realized pretty soon that I was not smart enough to become a good scientist. So instead I became a journalist. And I wrote for a couple of Dutch university newspapers and a few other, I did some freelance jobs. But in the end I was eager to do something else and also to leave the Netherlands. I wanted to live abroad for a while. And eventually I got a job at Science magazine, which you may know. Science is an American magazine. It's headquartered in Washington, D.C., but it really has a global audience and a global outlook, if you will. It's published by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is a not-for-profit organization. And I think I should explain this because it causes some confusion sometimes. Science is almost like two journals in one. Let me explain that. It's, on the one hand, it's a research journal. It's where scientists publish their data, their papers. And that looks like this, for instance. But it's also at the same time a news magazine with a very active website where we post stories every day. and mostly on biological sciences and physical sciences, but also a lot about science policy, current debates in science, and basically any story that might be interesting to science can find a home with us. And these two parts of the magazine operate completely independently. So we don't tell the other part of the magazine. I work for the news department, this department. We don't tell the scientific department what they need to publish, and they can't tell us what we should write. The two are sort of, it's like church and state, it's separate. As Lindsay said, I've had a variety of roles at Science. I started as a writer, and then I became in Washington, D.C. I moved to Paris later, and I was a European correspondent and a European news editor, and eventually became the international news editor. And right now I'm on a sabbatical for a year, which is one of the reasons I'm here, I guess. I could make this trip. And I'm currently based in Amsterdam. And I've written a lot of stories myself. I've sort of focused on global health and public health and infectious diseases. Those are, like the past 2 decades, those have been my main interests. This was a story I did a few years ago about La Rinconada, which is a town in Peru at more than 5 kilometers of altitude, where over 25% of the people suffer from chronic mountain sickness. It's a terrible problem that sort of ravages the body over the long term. And I followed a research team there who were studying that disease and also what you could do about it. Well, just to give you one other example, this is a story I wrote about a neuroscientist in Palestine, in the West Bank, who sort of amid all of the terrible political problems there, was trying to establish a research center for neuroscience. Those are just 2 examples. Well, like I said, the past 4 years I've been the international news editor, and one of the things I've focused on, and my colleagues as well, is expanding our network of freelance writers. We really want to have, we'd like to have eyes and ears in almost every country. Also because we cannot cover everything from Washington or from Europe. We need local people. So these are some of the people in recent years that that have written for us. And we're very happy and proud about that, but you can also see there are big gaps still on the map, so we're always looking for additional writers. Also because people move on sometimes, or they start doing other things. And if you've heard the virtual discussion yesterday about writing for international news outlets, you may have seen David Malakoff. He has succeeded me as the international news editor. So if you're a journalist and you're interested in writing for Science, you should contact David. He's a really nice guy. He's been a mentor to many many science writers. So you're in really good hands if you want to pitch a story or just talk about what you could do for science. Okay, and well, why is science journalism the best job in the world? Well, I'm not sure I really need to explain. I think we all know it. We have a front row seat to some of the most exciting intellectual adventures that humanity is undertaking, like astronomy. We tell people fascinating stories about animals that are long extinct that people love to read. We can show them the beauty of science, which is really, really important. It's not just about curiosity, but science has an intrinsic beauty, I think. And we can inform them about really important breakthroughs in medical science, for instance, about COVID. And I think science is also important for another reason, well, many reasons, but many developing countries hope that by investing in science, they can alleviate disease and poverty. I think that's a really important role. And as science journalists, we need to cover that as well. And then another really important reason is what some people call the war on science, right? There's so many people now question things that we thought were very well known and established as facts. Everything, we're in sort of post-truth area where everything is under fire. And we've seen a lot of that in the recent years, misinformation, disinformation. spread by social media, and I don't think we have a good answer to that yet. We don't know really what to do about that, but I think surely science journalism is one way that we can try to fight that. But I want to talk a little bit about our role as science journalists. So what is really our job in all of this? Are we cheerleaders for science who try to create excitement to get people enthusiastic for what the scientists are doing? Or are we more like tour guides, people who take the audience along to a world that they don't know very well, where they need guidance, where they need explanations, and sort of to make them feel safe in this strange world of science? Or to what extent should we be watchdogs? Do we need to look critically at science and show the readers where science goes wrong? Those are two very different types of roles, I think. And so the point I want to make is that, there's a lot of talk at this meeting about science communication, science popularization, or divulgation, science education. But I don't think that's necessarily the same as science journalism. I'd like to make a distinction between those two. And I'll explain to you why. And for that, I want to go back to one of the first big stories I wrote for Science. This was more than 20 years ago. A big clinical trial had been published in an important journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, and about a new drug to treat stroke. And I had heard through a contact that in that trial, a lot of data had been made up. It was one of those trials that have many hospitals, and a doctor at one hospital had just made up a lot of patients. And I was sort of shocked about that, because I guess I was more naive back then about science, but how could you enter data into a trial when you never even saw those patients? In a drug trial, based on a study like that, a drug may get approved, or people may draw conclusions about whether it works or not. So if you falsify the data, you're actually putting patients at risk. They might get the wrong drug. So it's really a terrible case. And that sort of got me interested in fraud and other types of misconduct in science. And in addition to writing about global health, I've written a lot of stories about misconduct and research integrity, and I find that really interesting. And some people ask, well, why would you focus on that? Why, we all know it happens, but does it really need to be exposed? It makes science look bad. It could undermine faith in science, and you just sort of spoil the fun, right? You're a bit of a party pooper, I guess. So why would you focus on that? Well, for me, I think it's fascinating and fun. I'm a big fan of Scandinavian crime series, and I love how a crime gets solved and all the detective work. Well, if you write about misconduct, you become a little bit of a detective yourself. You need to investigate the story, what happened, why, who was involved, how did it develop. So I think that's just absolutely fascinating. But there are more reasons. I think science, like any human endeavor, is flawed. It has its problems. And just like politics or economics, it must be held accountable. Somebody has to look into that. We can't all pretend that it's not happening. And I really think that if science journalists don't do that, I don't know who will, because a lot of bad stuff sort of is covered up. You never hear about it. So I think we have a role there. It's also really interesting because if you look into these cases, you learn a lot about how science really works, what happens behind the scenes, and why things go wrong, and the role of the journals, of the universities, the press officers, the scientists. It's all, you just learn a lot from it. So I just want to give you a couple of examples. This was a study published in Science, the journal I work for, in 2016. Like I said, I'm in the news department, so it had nothing to do with the publication. But it was a really alarming study. It showed that microplastics, these tiny fragments of plastics that are all in the rivers and oceans, that larvae of perch, which is a kind of fish, that they eat these microplastics, that they like them better than natural food. This is what this study claimed. And as a result, these fish change their behavior. They become less afraid. They swim out anywhere, and they are more likely to be eaten by predators. So this paper said this is really bad because, you know, we know there's a lot of microplastics. If these fish alter their behavior and they become eaten, they die, you know, this could have sort of a cascading effect on the ecology. We might lose a lot of fish just because of the microplastics. So a really important paper, got a lot of attention in the press. Many journalists wrote about it. But I came across these two people at the bottom there who were not involved in the study but quite familiar with it because they had been at the same research station as where the study was supposedly done. And at the top there you can see one of them sitting outside with a table with the researcher who had actually done the study. And she said, you know, I was there all the time she was there. She could never have done this study. There was just not enough time. She didn't have the equipment. She didn't have the right fish. I think this whole study is a lie. It's fake. It's entirely fake, and it got published in Science. Well, I thought that was really interesting. And by the way, the research station was in Gotland, which is an island in Sweden. So I guess I got my Scandinavian crime series right there. So I looked into that, and that resulted in this big story. So these two people, the whistleblowers, they were not believed at first. People said, they went to the university, which said, you know, nonsense, the study is fine, you should not have made these accusations. But they persisted, they appealed, they went to a national level. So a national committee in Sweden looked at it, and eventually they concluded that yes, this paper was entirely made up, nothing of it was true. So Science then retracted the paper. So the paper is no longer part of the scientific literature, and the researcher who made up these data lost her job actually. Well, once I'd done that story, I heard more about other scandals in fish science. So I've published a number of stories only about fraud in marine science. So rather limited, but every case was interesting to me and revealed new things about how science works. So this was another big feature that I did, I think in 2021. And then it just sort of kept going. I mean, this is a story that I wrote also in 2021. This is a young scientist who had written a paper, I think in 2014, about DNA barcoding of plants. And he'd done it together with a senior researcher who had provided the data. And he had analyzed those data and written a paper about it. But over time, he got questions. He had questions about his own paper. It was his very first paper. He'd never written anything before. But he started looking at the data again, and he had questions. And his co-author, who had collected the data supposedly, was not able to answer these questions, and there were all kinds of little things in them that were off. So he eventually said, after 7 years, I think, after publication, he said, I don't believe this paper anymore. I think it's wrong. I think it should be retracted. But the journal didn't want to do that. And so eventually he wrote a blog post about it. That's how I got interested. And I wrote a story about him because I thought it was really interesting. A scientist who wants his own paper retracted. That you don't hear that every day. And well, it took some time, but eventually the paper was retracted. So the guy you just saw was Ken Thompson, but his co-author was a very successful scientist in Canada named Stephen Newmaster. Well, once you start writing about fraud, you learn that it's rarely just one time. Very often people will, who make up data, will do so over and over again. So we decided, who is this to look into the question, who is this Stephen Newmaster? What else has he done? And I didn't do that story myself, but a freelancer of science, Charlie Piller, started looking into Stephen Newmaster, and what he discovered was just kind of astonishing. He had made up data in his CV, in speeches, he had plagiarized in his own biography. He was boasting of things in his CV that he had never done. It was just falsehoods on an epic scale in the work of this guy. So, and it's not just fraud, there's also obviously plagiarism, like this story I did about a French physicist who's also a very well-known science popularizer in France. He writes a lot about physics and the history of physics. And there, people discovered that he took texts from many other scientists, from philosophers, even from writers, and used them in his own papers and passed them off as his own. There were some really good writers like Émile Zola, so apparently he had taste, but you're still not supposed to do that, right? So I think this guy also lost his job. And so over the years, I've become convinced that fraud and plagiarism and all that bad stuff is far more common than we know, and than we realize, and then is exposed in the media. And you may have heard of this woman. Her name is Elizabeth Bick. She lives in close to San Francisco, but she's Dutch like me. And what she is very good at is looking at images in scientific papers and spotting where they are the same when they shouldn't be the same. And very often that is an indicator of fraud, because if scientists don't have the image that they need to prove a point, they'll sometimes use another image in its place. And she has found hundreds and hundreds of examples of this, virtually all of them pointing to deep problems and probably fraud. It could also sometimes be an innocent mistake, but very often it's not. And many papers have been retracted because of this. Some of you may also have heard of Retraction Watch. That is a blog, a website devoted entirely to the retraction of papers. So every time a paper is withdrawn from the literature, they look at it and ask why and who are the authors and what happened. And there's hundreds and hundreds of every year. So there are real deep problems in science, I think. Here's another example of a problem, and one that we were also quite involved in. I think about 10 years ago we published a profile of this scientist. Her name is Tanja Singer. She is a German researcher who studies empathy, and she thinks that through meditation we can become more empathetic and really, well, we can make a better world if we all become more kind, more compassionate. That is her subject of study. It was a really interesting profile. She's an interesting scientist, and it's 4 pages in Science. But then about 5 years later, in a bizarre twist of irony, this researcher who studied empathy was accused of making life hell for many of her colleagues. She was bullying them. She created an atmosphere of fear. Some people were traumatized by the way she behaved in the lab, especially younger colleagues, but they didn't dare say anything. So we felt, well, we did this profile of her. Now we of course we have to report this as well, because the reader has to know this. And it also made us question, well, why didn't we see that? Why didn't we, when we wrote that profile, why didn't we realize that there was a different persona underneath what we saw? And the journalist who wrote that story, Kai Kupferschmidt, he also tweeted about it. He said, I wrote this profile because she did such fascinating research and she seemed charming, intelligent, eloquent, but I never talked to people below her who work with her, what it's like in the lab. And so we concluded that was a mistake. We should have looked into that. Who was she really? Well, more misconduct. This is a story about Mexico by Emiliano, who's at the meeting also. About a plant geneticist who harassed a series of women, allegedly. And it brought up a whole discussion in Mexico about sexual harassment, which, from what I understand, was not a widely discussed issue at the time. And again, this was a big story in science that had wide repercussions. But there are other types of issues that I think need to be investigated. This is a story by Rodrigo Perez Ortega. He's also in Mexico, about a really interesting Brazilian fossil that made its way to Germany under rather mysterious circumstances, and it led to an interesting paper. But the Brazilians said, this was exported illegally. This is pure scientific colonialism, and it needs to come back. Rodrigo wrote several stories about this, and eventually the Germans agreed to give the fossil back, so it went back to Brazil. And we've done many other stories on scientific colonialism. So, well, my point is, so there's a lot of bad stuff to investigate, and we should do that. And I want to give you a few tips on what I've learned from about 2 decades of reporting on these issues. First is, the stories are everywhere if you keep your ears and eyes open. If you talk to a lot of scientists, you'll hear certain things about other scientists, or they say, this paper, I just can't believe that's true. Or you may hear about scientists harassing colleagues or bullying. If you're a journalist, you'll usually hear something, and that's that can be a starting point to investigate. My second tip is to collaborate if you can. Find somebody who will do the story with you, because together you have more reporting power, but also you can bounce what you find off each other, discuss the story. It can be just more fun. I'm working right now on another strange story with a colleague in San Diego, and every day we're emailing each other stuff, or we talk for a few minutes on the phone just to see where we are, and it's fun to do it that way. The third is these things take a lot of time, and that's one of the big problems. Not everybody has that time, but you need to be persistent. You need to really devote a lot of energy to this investigation to make it work, and you need to be inventive in the way you approach it. You may have to get documents through a freedom of information request, or maybe you need to look for business records of a company. You can't sort of do it the standard way that science journalists work all the time. Number 4, you have to be very, very careful and conscientious. A story like this can end somebody's scientific career. So you better be very, very careful and know what you're doing, and have all your facts straight, fact check it 10 times. And also just be professional and polite. I mean, I've written emails to people saying, how do you explain the discrepancies between this and that? Is this an innocent mistake or whatever? And sometimes it can be tempting when you think somebody is a really bad guy, to become aggressive, but I try always to be very professional. And finally, I think it helps to stay with the story. Once you've done a piece on something, keep following it. If there's an investigation, report on that. Ask what else people know. That's how I had a whole string of stories about fish science. I kept in touch with people, and one thing led to another. And you sort of build a body of work that together I think is even more illuminating. So to come back to this, and by the way, I could give you more examples. Don't want everybody to get depressed this morning because it is a nice day and an interesting meeting, but I just think there is a lot of bad things in science. And so I think we sometimes we can be cheerleaders and we can be the tour guides, but we have to do other things as well. I hope I convince you of that. And I think if we want to develop the public understanding of science, we also have to investigate and explain where and how science go wrong, what the conditions are, and how science rectifies the problems or doesn't. So I guess in retrospect, I'd like to change the title of my talk, if that's still possible, I don't know. But I'd like to make it Independent Critical Science Journalism is the Best Job in the World. Thank you for your attention.
Testing. Ok. Gracias, Martin, por esta charla súper importante. Ahora tenemos un poco tiempo para preguntas y quiero decir, si alguien quiere preguntar en español, yo puedo después decirlo en inglés para que todos estamos traduciendo.
Hi, Martin. How are you? Congratulations for your speech. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
What are the consequences for you to be critical?
What do you mean? The consequences for me?
Like the consequence, like the response of scientists to your articles, the politics.
Right. Well,
Because many times we want to be critical, we want to be independent, but we are afraid of.
Afraid?
Because many times we can have bad consequences to do this job.
Right. No, I recognize that, and that is difficult. I think I have the advantage that at Science, I have a job there. Science wants to publish these stories. Almost every time it asks our lawyer to look at them to make sure that they're bulletproof, that we really know exactly what we're doing. And then they get published, and it has not had many consequences for me personally. I mean, these scientists obviously sometimes are angry. Sometimes I get a letter or a letter from the lawyer. One time somebody called me a monster. But usually after a while you don't hear from them anymore. And so it has not have any grave consequences for me. I think it may be more difficult if you're in a different position as a journalist.
Hi, my name is Macarena, and I'm very thankful for listening to you. My question is about how you, or Science Magazine, engage common citizens, because in science communication you always think that you talk to the converse and
Right.
people that already have interested in science. So if the science journalists have a responsibility and this responsibility that you talk about, how you talk to common citizens that maybe doesn't know about Science Magazine or doesn't have the opportunity to read the magazine?
Right. No, that's a really important question. Our audience is actually mostly people working in science who already have an affinity with science. Also, policymakers or politicians who are interested in science. So, in a way, sometimes I think we're sort of preaching to the converted already, we probably never will reach a mass audience. So I think newspaper reporters have a bigger responsibility in reaching a broader audience. But we have done some stories. For instance, early in the pandemic, there was a video that went viral on the internet called Plandemic, and it was the whole idea was that the pandemic was a plan, to spread disease or to sell vaccines. I don't know. It was a kind of a crazy conspiracy video, and in that case we did a debunker. We did a story running by every claim that was made in that video, and explained why it wasn't true, why it was no basis at all. And so pretty long story, ticking off all these wild claims. And that story was picked up widely by a lot of people. We could tell that it went viral in itself. So there we felt, okay, we've done something for a broader audience who can see that this is just not wrong. Of course, many people thought we were part of the conspiracy back then. And in fact, I never got so much hate mail as after that story, because I was being paid by Bill Gates and blah blah blah. It was I still get emails sometimes now, 3 years later, about that particular story.
Thanks, Martin. I think that everyone agrees that this is, important journalism that needs to be done, and that this is sort of the power that journalism can have a lot of time resides in one's ability to critique science. But I think it's also important to note, as you did in the previous question, that this is something that's a lot more difficult for early career and international reporters to get into, in part because the stories themselves are harder to find, and because you're sort of acquiring a lot more risk as you go about reporting the stories. And I'm curious if you have tips for young journalists in Latin American countries who want to do this type of important reporting. How can they find stories like this, and how can they go about approaching them in a safe way?
Right, great question. Well, like I said, finding them is I think doesn't have to be so hard if you listen to what people tell you. If you have a lot of contacts in the scientific world, you will probably come across stories that might merit an investigation. How you do them, I find it difficult to because I don't know exactly how science communication in Chile works, and I find it difficult to say. I think I would, like I said, try to find somebody else to do the story with you. I probably also would try to get a good sense of the legal risks. You know, could you be sued, and then what could happen? That's something really to consider. So that might be easier if you work for an established newspaper who was willing to take on that risk. I think for freelancers, it's almost impossible to take that risk unless you have insurance or something. But to take it on your own shoulders, I think is dangerous. And if you write for science, by the way, if our freelancers write a story that gets us into legal problems, and we have been sued a couple of times, then we will take on the defense. Even if the suit is against the writer, science will defend them. But I know that, and that's even in our contracts that we will do that. But I know a lot of news outlets don't do that. So as a freelancer, I think it's very tricky to do. Also because of the time investment. Although I should say science also has a fund for investigative journalism, and for these really big projects where we realize you can't do this in a week or even a month, we have extra money available to cover the time that you spend simply on figuring out what went wrong and the reporting, really.
I'm going to take a liberty here and ask a question follow-up. I think that's a really important detail. And so if you have freelancers, for example, in LATAM or other places, in other countries who might be in different circumstances from where science is based or where you're based, what are the kinds of things that freelancers should be asking you for to help them feel protected? What's available, what's not available? But I think in my case, for example, it didn't occur to me in the beginning that I could ask for funds for translation. So are there other things that a freelancer might not think to ask for that you can do to help them?
Well, I think one of the most important things that we will do as science, like I said, is if we agree to do the story, we will, and we realize it's going to take a lot of time, we can sometimes support that with extra money, basically a higher fee. I'm trying to think of other things that we can do to help. One thing we'll certainly want to do is to make sure that the story is on very solid ground. I mean, we did a story a while back about the pandemic in, was it Ecuador? Yeah, I think it was in Ecuador, where a few scientists were accused of wrongdoing early on in the pandemic, something having to do with a government contract to buy diagnostic tests. I forget the exact details, but anyway, some scientists were accused of criminal behavior in a scandal about commercial tests. And that story, the writer who covered it thought it would be a fairly easy story, but because it was about a criminal issue, we were pretty demanding in saying, you really need to go through the court documents, we really need to understand exactly what happened. I mean, they seemed like false allegations, like a political thing, but it was just a bit unclear. So asked the writer to really spend a lot of time looking into the issue and clarifying the exact conditions. And that getting court documents sometimes can be a real hassle.
Okay, now we have a question in Spanish.
Hola, quería preguntar ¿por qué usted cree que se ha propagado tanta desinformación en los medios actualmente? ¿Por qué usted cree que se ha propagado tanta desinformación en los medios actualmente, en los medios de comunicación?
Okay, could you just translate
Yeah.
it?
Why do you think that there's been so much information, misinformation in communication outlets? Was that the question? Yeah. In the
About the
media.
pandemic or in general?
In general. In general.
Yeah, I wish we understood it better. I've been sort of astonished by how easy disinformation spreads today. I remember writing about Ebola outbreaks in Africa about a decade ago, and you heard these stories that the people there believed that Ebola was brought in by Western scientists. There was a plot to sterilize Africans or to depopulate Africa. And often I was like, God, this is incredible. What these poor people, they have these terrible beliefs about a disease that are completely wrong. And I sometimes felt like I'm glad we don't have that stuff, in Europe. But 10 years later, we're in the exact same position. We have these wild conspiracies, and people, journalists even sometimes, who believe them. I think the social media play a very important part in that. They amplify news, or not news, but messages that draw attention, that get people riled up, that people want to respond to. And so you get this polarizing effect. And I think that's one important reason why this information spreads so rapidly. Not just about diseases, but about anything. I just showed you a picture of the so-called flat Earth theory. I mean, it's just too crazy almost to even talk about, but there's a growing group of people who believes that the Earth is flat and that everything we know about the round Earth is sort of a conspiracy, and it's rapidly growing. Thanks, they do their own analysis, they publish papers. It's unimaginable, but I think social media play a big role in that. It's how people communicate and how they spread these things. Does that answer your question a little bit?
I'm Nicolas Luco, and could you please describe the weekly meeting of science? Is it a conflictive meeting? How much does it last? Are you standing or sitting?
It's a great question. Well, so the newsroom, which I work for, is about 25 people. We have daily meetings where we go through the list of stories that we are working on, that we're going to publish this day or online or later in the week in the print magazine. They're mostly Zoom meetings. They have been since 2020, obviously. But it's also because it's a team around the world. There's some people in Washington, but also in Tokyo and in Europe. It's a fairly harmonious meeting. There are not that many conflicts. But there is sometimes debate about how important is this story. So, sometimes one reporter will push for a story that they think is really interesting, and the rest is like, well, I don't really see it, or you need to do more work on that. So it's not all that exciting, the meeting, actually.
All right, we have time for one more quick question, and then we'll be moving to our coffee break.
Hi, Martin, thank you. I'm from Spain, and in my experience as a science journalist, many scientists tell us about misconduct or harassment stories, but only off the record, because they are afraid to lose their chance to improve their careers. It's a very hierarchical society in science profession. So how do you manage this problem? How do you convince them to collaborate with you as a journalist to write your stories?
So if I understand you correctly, it's about that scientists often don't want to talk about these problems because they worry about their careers, right?
Yes, they want to talk to you. Many times they talk to me and tell me stories, but off the record.
Yeah.
They don't, just to cry a little bit.
That is a huge
but
problem.
Then if we want to write the story, then they say, no, but I think I'm not gonna talk to you. Don't write the story because I could be recognized by my chief, or and then they don't want to collaborate anymore.
No, there's a lot of that. I showed you the photo of these whistleblowers. They were very worried in the beginning because many scientists say they want. They want to know the truth, and science should be self-correcting. If something is wrong, it should be corrected. But the fact is that these whistleblowers are often ostracized. Nobody likes them. Nobody is thankful for what they do. It's a very dangerous thing even to do in your career, especially if you don't have an established position and you're a PhD student, for instance. So I've talked to many people who told me, you cannot use my name, or I want you to know this, but you cannot write this information because they will know it came from me. So you need to find another way to confirm that information that doesn't lead back to me. This happens all the time. And sometimes that means you almost cannot do a story, but what we often do is say, a scientist who asked not to be identified, and then we quote somebody anonymously. That's something that happens from time to time. But I agree there's a tremendous amount of fear, especially if you're attacking a powerful scientist. They have so much influence on your career. Where your papers get published, what lab you may go to next for your postdoc. So people are really afraid of exposing things, and I think these stories have given me a much bigger appreciation for the few people who do stand up and who tell the truth, even if they take a personal risk. And it also made me realize that nobody would do that just for fun, because people who are attacked often say, "Oh, this is all wrong. This is just doing it to advance their own careers," but that's absolute nonsense, because whistleblowing I think almost never advances your career. Usually it leads to trouble.
All right. Muchas gracias por este panel, por todas las preguntas como muy importantes. Ahora les invito a disfrutar nuestro coffee break y podemos hablar más con Martin después.
Thank you.